Good morning, friends. Tolstoy's dream has come true. Prisoners are no longer compelled to attend pernicious religious services. The prison churches have been shut down. True, their buildings remain, but they have been successfully adapted to enlarge the prisons themselves. 2,000 additional prisoners have thereby been housed in the Butriki church. And in the course of a year, estimating an average turnover of 2 weeks, another 50,000 will pass through the cells in what was once the church. On arriving at the Butriki for the 4th or 5th time, hurrying confidently to my assigned cell, through the courtyard surrounded by prison buildings, and even outstripping the jailer by a shoulder, like a horse that hurries without the urging of whip or reins home to where the oats are waiting. I sometimes even forget to glance at the square church rising into an octagon. It stood apart in the middle of the courtyard quadrangle. Its muzzles were not machine-made of glass, reinforced with iron rods as they were in the main section of the prison. They were rotten, unplaned gray boards, pure and simple, and they indicated the building's second-rank priority. What they maintained there was a kind of intra-Butriki transit prison, so to speak, for recently sentenced prisoners. And at one time, in 1945, I had experienced it as a big, important step when they led us into the church after our OSO sentencing. And that was the right time to do it, too. It was a good time for prayer. Took us up to the 2nd floor, and the 3rd floor was also partitioned off, and from the octagonal vestibule distributed us among different cells. Mine was the southeast cell. There was a large square cell in which at the time 200 prisoners were confined. They were sleeping, as they did everywhere else there, on the bunks, and they were one-story bunks, under the bunks, and just simply on the tile floor out in the aisles. Not only were the muzzles on the windows second-rate, everything else, too, was in a style appropriate not to true sons of Butriki, but to its stepsons. No books, no chess sets, no checkers were distributed to this swarming mass, and the dented aluminum bowls and beat-up wooden spoons were collected and removed from one mealtime to another for fear that in the rush they might get carried off on prisoner transports. They were even stingy with mugs for the stepsons. They washed the bowls after the gruel, and then the prisoners had to lap up their tea slops out of them. The absence of one's own dishes was particularly acute for those who experienced the mixed blessing of receiving a parcel from their families. Despite their meager means, relatives made a special effort to provide parcels in those last days before the prisoner transports left. The families had had no prison education themselves, and they never got any good advice in the prison reception office either, and therefore they didn't send plastic dishes, the one and only kind prisoners were allowed to have, but glass or metal ones instead. All these honeys, jams, condensed milks were pitilessly poured and scraped out of their cans through the swill trough in the cell door into whatever the prisoner had. And in the church cells he had nothing at all, which meant that he simply got it in the palms of his hands, in his mouth, in his handkerchief, in the flaps of his coat, which was quite normal in Gulag terms, but not in the center of Moscow. At the same time, the jailer kept hurrying him as if he were late for his train. The jailer hurried him because he was counting on licking out whatever was left in the jars. Everything was temporary in the church cells, without that illusion of permanency which existed in the interrogation cells and in the cells where prisoners awaited sentencing. Ground meat, a semi-processed product, partially prepared for Gulag. The prisoners were unavoidably here those few days until a bit of space had been cleared for them at Krasnaya Presnya. They had just one special privilege here. 3 times a day they were allowed to go for their gruel themselves. No grits were given out here, but the gruel was served 3 times a day, and this was a merciful thing because it was more frequent, hotter, and stuck to the ribs better. This special privilege was allowed because there were no elevators in the church, as there were in the rest of the prison, and the jailers had no wish to exert themselves. The big, heavy kettles had to be carried from a long way off across the yard, and then up a steep flight of stairs. It was hard work, and the prisoners had very little strength for it, but they went willingly just to get out into the green yard one more time and hear the birds singing. The church cells had their own air. It held a fluttering presentiment of the drafts of future transit prisons, of the winds of the Arctic camps. In the church cells you celebrated the ritual of getting adjusted to the fact that your sentence had been handed down and that it wasn't in the least a joke, to the fact that no matter how cruel the new era of your life might be, your mind must nevertheless digest and accept it, and you arrived at that with great difficulty. And you had no permanent cellmates here as you did in the interrogation cells, which made the latter something like a family. Day and night, people were brought in and taken away singly and by tens. and as a result the prisoners kept moving ahead along the floor and along the bunks, and it was rare to lie next to any one neighbor for more than 2 nights. Once you met an interesting person there, you had to question him immediately, because otherwise you would miss out for good and all. And that is how I missed out on the automobile mechanic Medvedev. When I began to talk to him, I remember that his name had been mentioned by the Emperor Mikhail. Yes, he had indeed been implicated in the same case as Mikhail, because he had been one of the first to read the manifesto to the Russian people, and had failed to write a denunciation. Medvedev had been given an unforgivably, shamefully light sentence, 3 years, and under Article 58, too, for which even 5 years was considered a juvenile sentence. They had evidently decided the emperor was really insane, and had been easy on the rest of them because of class considerations. But I had hardly pulled myself together to ask how Medvedev regarded all this than they took him off with his things. Certain circumstances led us to conclude that he had been taken off to be released, and this confirmed those first rumors of the Stalinist amnesty, which reached our ears that summer, the amnesty for no one, an amnesty after which everything was just as crowded as before, even under the bunks. They took my neighbor, an elderly Schutzbündler, off to a prisoner transport. Here in the land of the world proletariat, all those Schutzbündlers, who had been suffocating in conservative Austria, had been roasted with tenors, and on the islands of the Archipelago they met their end. And there was a swarthy little fellow with coal-black hair and feminine-looking eyes like dark cherries, but with a broad, larger than usual nose that spoiled his whole face, turning it into a caricature. For a day he and I lay next to each other in silence, and on the second day he found occasion to ask me, "What do you think I am?" He spoke Russian correctly and fluently, but with an accent. I hesitated. There seemed to be something of Transcaucasia in him, Armenian, presumably. He smiled. I used to pass myself off very easily as a Georgian. My name is Yasha. Everyone laughed at me. I collected trade union dues. I looked him over. He was truly a comical figure, a half-pint, his face out of proportion, asymmetrical, his smile amiable. And then suddenly he tensed up, his features sharpened, his eyes narrowed and cut me like the stroke of a black saber. I am an intelligence officer of the Romanian General Staff. Lieutenant Vladimirescu. I started. This was real dynamite. I had met a couple of 100 fabricated spies, and I had never thought I might meet up with a real one. I thought they didn't exist. According to his story, he was of an aristocratic family. From the age of 3, he had been destined to serve on the general staff. At 6, he had entered the intelligence service school. Growing up, he had picked his own field of future activity, the Soviet Union, taking into account that here in Russia the most relentless counterintelligence service in the world existed, and that it was particularly difficult to work here because everyone suspected everyone else. And he now concluded he had worked here not at all badly. He had spent several pre-war years in Nikolaev, and it appears had arranged for the Romanian armies to capture a shipyard intact. Subsequently, he had been at the Stalingrad tractor factory, and after that at the Urals heavy machinery factory. In the course of collecting trade union dues, he had entered the office of the chief of a major division of the plant, and had shut the door behind him, and his idiotic smile had promptly left his face, and that saber-sharp, cutting expression had appeared. Ponomaryev. And Ponomaryev was using an altogether different name at the Urals heavy machinery factory. We have been keeping track of you from Stalingrad on. You left your job there. He had been some kind of big wig at the Stalingrad tractor factory. And you have set yourself up here under an assumed name. You can choose to be shot by your own people or to work with us. Ponomaryev chose to work with them, and that indeed was very much in the style of those super-successful pigs. The lieutenant supervised his work until he himself was transferred to the jurisdiction of the German intelligence officer resident in Moscow. Who sent him from Podolsk to work at his specialty. As Vladimirescu explained to me, intelligence officers and saboteurs are given an all-around training, but each of them has his own narrow area of specialization, and Vladimirescu's special field was cutting the main cord of a parachute on the inside. Oh, in Podolsk, he was met at the parachute warehouse by the chief of a warehouse guard. Who was it? What kind of person was he? Who at night led Vladimirescu into the warehouse for 8 hours. Climbing up to the piles of parachutes on his ladder and managing not to disturb the piles, Vladimirescu pulled out the braided main support cord and with special scissors cut 4/5 of the way through it, leaving 1/5 intact so that you would break in the air. Vladimirescu had studied many long years in preparation for this one night, and now, working feverishly in the course of 8 hours, he ruined, according to his account, upwards of 2,000 parachutes, 15 seconds per parachute. I destroyed the whole Soviet parachute division. His cherry-like eyes sparkled with malice. When he was arrested, he refused to give any testimony for 8 whole months. Imprisoned in the Butriki, he uttered not one word. And they didn't torture you? No. His lips twitched as though to indicate he didn't even consider such a thing possible in the case of a non-Soviet citizen. Beat your own people so foreigners will be more afraid of you. But a real spy is a gold mine. After all, we may use him for an exchange. The day came when they showed him the newspapers. Romania had capitulated. Come on now, testify. He continued to keep silent. The newspapers could have been forgeries. They showed him an order of the Romanian General Staff under the conditions of the armistice. The General Staff ordered all its intelligence agents to cease operations and surrender. He continued to keep silent. The order could have been a forgery. Finally, he was confronted with his immediate superior on the General Staff, who ordered him to disclose his information and surrender. At this point, Vladimirescu cold-bloodedly gave his testimony, and now, in the slow passing of the cell day, it was no longer of any importance, and he told me some of it too. They had not even tried him. They had not even given him his sentence. After all, he wasn't one of our own. I am a career man, and will remain one until I die, and they won't waste me. But you are revealing yourself to me, I pointed out. I might very well remember your face. Just imagine our meeting some day in public. If I am convinced that you haven't recognized me, you will remain alive. If you recognize me, I will kill you, or else force you to work for us. He had not the slightest desire to spoil his relationship with his cell neighbor. He said this very simply, with total conviction. I was really convinced that he wouldn't hesitate for a moment to gun someone down or cut their throat. In this whole long prisoner's chronicle, we will not again meet such a hero. It was the only encounter of the sort I ever had in my 11 years in prison, camp, and exile, and others didn't even have one. And our mass circulation comics tried to dupe young people into believing that these are the only people the organs catch. It was enough to look around that church cell to grasp that it was youth itself the organs were catching in the first place. The war had ended, and we could allow ourselves the luxury of arresting everyone who had been singled out. They were no longer needed as soldiers. They said that in 1944 and 45, a so-called Democratic Party had passed through the cells of the small Moscow province, Lubyanka. According to rumor, it had consisted of 100 boys and its own statutes and its membership cards. The eldest of them was a pupil in the 10th grade of a Moscow school, and he was its general secretary. Students were also glimpsed fleetingly in the prisons during the last year of the war. I met some here and there. I was presumably not old myself, but they at any rate were younger. How imperceptibly all that crept up on us, while I, my co-defendant, and others of our age, had been fighting for 4 years at the front. A whole new generation had grown up here in the rear, and it had been very long since we ourselves had tramped the parquet floors of the university corridors, considering ourselves the youngest and most intelligent in the whole country, and for that matter, on earth. And then suddenly pale youths crossed the tile floors of the prison cells to approach us haughtily, and we learned with astonishment that we were no longer the youngest and most intelligent. They were. But I didn't take offense at this. At that point I was already happy to move over a bit to make room. I knew so very well their passion for arguing with anyone, for finding out everything. I understood their pride in having chosen a worthy lot and in not regretting it. It gave me gooseflesh to hear the rustle of the prison halos hovering over those self-enamored and intelligent little faces. 1 month earlier, in another Butriki cell, a semi-hospital cell. I had just stepped into the aisle and had still not seen any empty place for myself, when approaching in a way that hinted at a verbal dispute, even at an entreaty to enter into one, came a pale, yellowish youth with a Jewish tenderness of face, wrapped despite the summer in a threadbare soldier's overcoat shot full of holes. He was chilled. His name was Boris Gamarov. He began to question me. Conversation rolled along. On one hand, our biographies, on the other, politics. I don't remember why, but I recalled one of the prayers of the late President Roosevelt, which had been published in our newspapers, and I expressed what seemed to me a self-evident evaluation of it. "Well, that's hypocrisy, of course." And suddenly the young man's yellowish brows trembled, his pale lips pursed. He seemed to draw himself up, and he asked me, "Why? Why do you not admit the possibility that a political leader might sincerely believe in God?" And that is all that was said. But what a direction the attack had come from! To hear such words from someone born in 1923! I could have replied to him very firmly, but prison had already undermined my certainty. And the principal thing was that some kind of clean, pure feeling does live within us, existing apart from all our convictions. And right then it dawned upon me that I had not spoken out of conviction, but because the idea had been implanted in me from outside. And because of this I was unable to reply to him, and I merely asked him, "Do you believe in God?" "Of course," he said tranquilly. "Of course? Of course." Yes, yes. The Komsomols were flying ahead of the flock, everywhere, but so far only the KGB had noticed. Notwithstanding his youth, Borya Gamarov had not only fought as a sergeant in an anti-tank unit, with those anti-tank 45s the soldier had christened Farewell Motherland. He had also been wounded in the lungs, and the wound had not yet healed, and because of this, TB had set in. Gamarov had been given a medical discharge from the army and enrolled in the biology department of Moscow University, and thus two strands intertwined in him, one from his life as a soldier, and the other, the by no means foolish and by no means dead student's life at war's end. A circle formed of those who thought and reasoned about the future, even though no one had given them any instructions to do so, and the experienced eye of the organ singled out 3 of them and pulled them in. In 1937, Gamarov's father had been killed in prison or shot, and his son was hurrying along the same path. During the interrogation, he had read several of his own verses to the interrogator with feeling. I deeply regret that I have not managed to remember even one of them, and there is nowhere to seek them out today, otherwise I would have cited them here. For a number of months after that, my path crossed those of all 3 co-defendants. Right there in a Butriki cell, I met Vyacheslav D., and there is always someone like him when young people are arrested. He had taken an iron stand within the group, but he quickly broke down under interrogation. He got less than any of the others, 5 years, and it looked as though he were secretly counting a good deal on his influential papa to get him out. And then in the Butriki church I encountered Georgy Ingol, the eldest of the 3. Despite his youth, he was already a candidate member of the Union of Soviet Writers. He had a very bold pen. His style was one of strong contrasts. He had been willing to make his peace politically. Vivid and untrodden literary paths would have opened up before him. He had already nearly finished a novel about Debussy, but his early success had not emasculated him, and at the funeral of his teacher, Yuri Tinyanov, he had made a speech declaring that Tinyanov had been persecuted, and by this means he had assured himself of an 8-year term. And right then Gamarov caught up with us, and while waiting to go to Krasnaya Presnya, I had to face up to their united point of view. This confrontation was not easy for me. At the time I was committed to the world outlook which is incapable of admitting that any new fact or evaluating any new opinion before a label had been found for it from the already available stock, be it the hesitant duplicity of the petty bourgeoisie or the militant nihilism of the déclassée intelligentsia. I didn't recall that Ingol and Gamarov attacked Marx in my presence, but I do remember that they attacked Lev Tolstoy, and from what direction the attack was launched. Tolstoy rejected the church, but he failed to take into account its mystical and its organizing role. He rejected the teachings of the Bible, but for the most part modern science was in conflict with the Bible, not even with its opening lines about the creation of the world. He rejected the state, but without the state there would be chaos. He preached the combining of mental and physical work in one's individual life, but that was a senseless leveling of capabilities and talents. And finally, as we see from Stalin's violence, an historical personage can be omnipotent, yet Tolstoy scoffed at the very idea. The boys read me their own verses and demanded mine in exchange, and I as yet had none. They read Pasternak particularly, whom they praised to the skies. I had once read My Sister Life, and hadn't liked it, considering its precious, abstruse, and very, very far from ordinary human paths. But they recited to me Lieutenant Schmidt's last speech at his trial, and it touched me deeply because it applied so to us. For 30 years I have nurtured my love for my native land, and I shall neither expect nor miss your leniency. Gamarov and Ingal were just as shiningly attuned as that. We do not need your leniency. We are not languishing from imprisonment. We are proud of it. But who is really capable of not languishing? After a few months, Ingal's young wife renounced and abandoned him. Gamarev, because of his revolutionary inclinations, did not even have a sweetheart yet. Was it not here, in these prison cells, that the great truth dawned? The cell was constricted, but wasn't freedom even more constricted? Was it not our own people, tormented and deceived, that lay beside us there under the bunks and in the aisles? Not to arise with my whole land would have been harder still, and for the path that I have trod I have no qualms at all. The young people imprisoned in these cells under the political articles of the Code were never the average young people of the nation, but were always separated from them by a wide gap. In those years, most of our young people still faced a future of disintegrating, of becoming disillusioned, indifferent, falling in love with an easy life, and then perhaps beginning all over again the bitter climb from that cozy little valley up to a new peak, possibly after another 20 years. But the young prisoners of 1945, sentenced under 5810, had leaped that whole future chasm of indifference in one jump, and bore their heads boldly erect under the axe. In the Butriki church, the Moscow students, already sentenced, cut off and estranged from everything, wrote a song, and before twilight sang it in their uncertain voices. 3 times a day we go for gruel. The evenings we pass in song. With a contraband prison needle, we sew ourselves bags for the road. We don't care about ourselves anymore. We signed just to be quicker. And when will we ever return here again from the distant Siberian camps? Good Lord, how could we have missed the main point of the whole thing? While we had been plowing through the mud out there in the bridgeheads, while we had been cowering in shell holes and pushing binocular periscopes above the bushes, back home a new generation had grown up and gotten moving. But hadn't it started moving in another direction, in a direction we wouldn't have been able and wouldn't have dared to move in? They weren't brought up the way we were. Our generation would return, having turned in its weapons, jingling its heroes' medals, proudly telling its combat stories, and our younger brothers would only look at us contemptuously. Oh, you stupid dolts. End of part 2. That's it for this book, friends. I heard that there is a part 3, and I will try to get it and read that to you as well. Have a good day.